Germany's Frankfurt, AP, even as Ukraine rejoices in recent triumphs on the battlefield, its leadership faces a huge financial challenge: how to cover the enormous cost of the war effort without inciting uncontrollable price increases for common people or accumulating debt that could obstruct post-war reconstruction. Finding loans or gifts to cover a sizable budget deficit for the following year is difficult, since doing so would require employing central bank bailouts, which run the danger of devaluing Ukraine's currency, the hryvnia. Key details of Ukraine's economic conflict with Russia are as follows. How has Ukraine so far financed its defense? The Ukrainian administration sought intermittent outside assistance in the early stages of Russia's invasion. The central bank used freshly produced money to purchase government bonds when it was short on cash. The other option was to discontinue paying people's pensions and government wages. Even while it was a desperately needed stopgap measure at the time, economists warn that printing money runs the risk of allowing inflation to spiral out of control and eventually devaluing the nation's currency. According to Shapoval, vice president for policy research at the Kyiv School of Economics, Ukraine has been through this, so we know what inflation that is out of control looks like, and we don't want this to happen again. By creating so much money, the government and central bank have already stepped into a precipice. During a time when Russia is attempting to demoralize the populace by cutting off power and water as winter approaches, price stability and the capacity to pay pensions have a significant impact on everyday people and society. Price increases have made it difficult for those with lower incomes to afford food because inflation is already high, 27%. We are anxious and it is quite gloomy. We were surviving on outdated supplies of food, but now that the light is out and the refrigerator is broken, we must throw away the food, the 80-year-old recently remarked. She claimed that although the Russians had continued to pay her Ukrainian pension in rubles, they had stopped doing so as of October. She stated that she is relying on the government to reimburse any lost pension funds. The cost of natural gas, according to Tetiana Weinstein, a resident of Kherson, prevents her from heating her home. "I'm chilly," the 68-year-old said. "I like warmth, and I'm very cold." How much assistance does Ukraine require? According to President Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine needs $17 billion for a war damage repair fund and $38 billion in direct aid from Western allies, including the United States and the EU, which has 27 members. According to economists affiliated with the Kyiv School of Economics, $50 billion in total aid from donors would be sufficient to see Ukraine through the year. In comparison to last year, defense spending is 6 times higher in the recently approved 2023 budget by the Ukrainian parliament. Spending on defense and security will account for 43% of the budget, or staggering 18.2% of annual economic output. What impact could finances have on the results of the war? Russia's economy has fared better than Ukraine's despite Western sanctions because high oil and natural gas prices have helped the Kremlin's budget. Plans to set a price restriction on Russian oil sales by the EU and partners in the group of 7 countries seek to change that. By the middle of next year, we believe that the economic situation will shift strongly in favor of Ukraine, making strong partner support particularly important over the period until that point, the Kyiv School economists predict. What amount of financing does Ukraine currently have? Although $29.2 billion has been pledged by EU institutions and member states, tracking team leader Christoph Trebesch noted that many of their commitments are arriving in Ukraine with considerable delays. The EU's executive body, the European Commission, has proposed €18 billion in no-interest, long-term loans for the following year, but member nations must still approve the proposal. Also likely to increase contributions is the United States. Nevertheless, Ukraine prefers grants to loans. In the event that all financing is provided through loans, debt would increase from 83% at present and 69% prior to the war to over 100% of annual economic output. Spending on the post-war recovery could be hampered by that burden. The Commission suggested that in order for Ukraine to receive loans, it must reduce its history of corruption. Ukraine's score on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index increased from 26 to 32 out of 100 since 2014. It is still not fantastic, but it is improving. U.S. officials have commended Ukraine's online procurement system for $6 billion in cost savings and for bringing transparency to government contracts, a major source of collusion and shady practices. Additionally, the possibility of EU membership motivates Ukraine to combat corruption. A helping hand from the International Monetary Fund. Ukraine has received $1.4 billion in emergency aid from the IMF and $1.3 billion to help it cope with the shock of lost food exports. With the assistance, in particular, of the G7 and the German leadership, she claimed, we are on the way to come up with a sound and substantial proposal for Ukraine. However, lending money where the loans are unsustainable goes against IMF policies for a larger loan package of $15 billion to $20 billion, and the war raises concerns about it. Since Ukraine does not yet have territorial sovereignty, the organization has been unwilling to lend to such nations. According to Adnan Mazarii, senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and former deputy director of the IMF's Middle East and Central Asia Department, the IMF would have to seriously twist its existing framework or change it to provide substantial sums.